Our story thus far. The year is 1533. Three-Quarter Ale, a brand new band comprised of Ariana Pale Ale, Rosemary Quench, and Wicked Pete Speakeasy, has auditioned to play for the King and Queen's Christmas feast. They've made it into the top 3 choices, but they'll be required to audition again, and there can be no alterations to the act or substitutions of personnel. The inclusion of these cheeky new upstarts has made the leader of one of the other bands very unhappy, and he has vowed that they shall not make it to the second audition. Interrupting an otherwise lovely sunny day at the market, a young beggar boy who has been the recipient of Rosemary's kindness has run to find her. He has seen her friend Wicked Pete being press-ganged onto an infamous pirate ship called the Moira. The women have dropped their shopping baskets and are running to the dockside now. Skidding to a halt as they neared the dock, Rosemary ducked behind a wide shrub, parting the branches just enough to see through. Through the leaves, she could see a few sailors on a hackney boat which was slowly taking leave of a massive ship. The sailors' latest journey having been completed, no doubt they were heading ashore to the alehouse to find a refreshing drink and their next few months' worth of employment. The ship from which they departed was magnificent and meticulously kept, with tall masts soaring above the deck. Bedecking the prow was the brightly painted wooden figure of an Arab maiden, bare-breasted and wild-looking, and the ship's name was emblazoned on the side, the Moira. Above an abundance of gun ports, the deck was aswarm with bodies busy in their tasks. Through the branches, they could see that the ship was already sailing swiftly away from shore. As the disembarking sailors reached land and headed toward a dockside pub, Rosemary shifted the branches wider, and what caught her eye prompted her to suck in her breath. "Look, there!" Standing alone on the now empty dock was a small man clad all in black, watching the ship as it departed. "Is not that the fellow from Gravesend Consort?" Ariana nodded. She would know that arrogant stance and that ferret-like profile anywhere.
"Filbert, but wherefore would he—"
Lord Vainglory said that any act which appeared in December, with any changes whatsoever in personnel, would be disqualified. Can you not conceive? Ariana could. Philibert turned crisply on his heel and departed. Rosemary saw that the dock was now deserted, and she let the branches she had been holding close with a snap. "All right, we shall have to find out where the Moira docks next and hope to board her there."
"Board the Moira!"
Ariana's blue eyes were large as saucers.
"Art thou mad?
"If we must."
We cannot board a pirate ship. And in any event, we are too late. She is gone."
"Then let us discover where she docks next and go after her."
"Thou art mad."
"Fine. Stay here if thou dost wish. I am going to find that ship, and I shall rescue Pete, alone if I must." Rosemary began to rise.
"Rosie, I do not think you quite grasp that these are pirates."
"I shall rescue Pete!" There was a blaze in Rosemary's eyes which Ariana had not seen before, not even at Rosemary's most passionate. At length,
"How shall you find out where next she docks, then?"
Rosemary noted Ariana's "you," but made no comment. She thrust the branches aside once more and looked toward the sailors who were heading for the tavern. Finally, she rose and straightened her skirts. "I have an idea, at least how I might find out where the Moira will next dock."
"What is it?"
"In sooth, dear friend, I would prefer not to say. It affords some danger in the execution, and I do not wish to be talked out of it, as no doubt you would try to do if you knew it. So, keep safe, sister of my heart. I love thee, and with God's help shall see thee soon." Rosemary hugged Ariana tightly, but still the Roma girl entreated her.
"Be there any other way?"
"None I can think of."
"And you are determined?"
Rosemary turned to depart, but Ariana stopped her with a hand. She knew without asking that even if it meant leaving her dearest friend behind, Rosemary would go after Pete. It was not a question of choosing one friend over the other. It was just Rosemary's way of doing what she thought was right and figuring out how to deal with the consequences once the danger had passed.
"I can understand that, admire it even,"
Ariana thought.
"But what shall I do if she leaves?"
Ariana had said goodbye to her mother already.
"I do not think I could bear to say goodbye to Rosemary, too."
Rosemary was waiting for her to speak, her hand still in Ariana's, but her weight already shifting toward shore.
"Sister, I think thou art touched. But, oh Lord, help me. Tell me what to do. I will follow thee."
Rosemary kissed Ariana's cheek in a quick burst of gratitude. "Art thou certain? My plan is—"
"I have given thee my word. Just tell me what to do already."
"How quick canst thou be with thy dagger if I need thee?" Ariana replied by whipping the dagger from its sheath and presenting it to Rosemary handle forward before Rosemary had even drawn another breath. Smiling, Rosemary squeezed Ariana's other hand as Jimmie stared with his mouth agape. "'Twill be enough, sister. I thank thee with all my heart. Come." With Jimmie and Ariana close on her heels, Rosemary followed the path taken by the docking sailors to a disreputable little tavern nearby. The noise issuing forth was deafening, and they could hear, even from this distance, an explosion of foreign accents and braggartly voices. All male. "Sister, do you trust me?" At her companion's anxious nod, Rosemary looked at Ariana a moment, then gently reached up and removed the hematite moon from Ariana's forehead. She then pulled on the sleeves of Ariana's chemise to bare her shoulders and fluffed her friend's long blonde hair until it billowed in a golden cloud. She looked at Ariana again, adjusting one shoulder of her chemise, and decided she was satisfied. "God, I have not often thanked thee for making me a woman in a man's world, but I thank thee now. Thou hast not given me physical strength or lands, but thou hast gifted me with the one thing that can control men of all climes. Begging thy pardon for what I'm about to do with it." Rosemary pulled her own chemise down until the neckline was barely visible above her bodice, the cloth plunging to reveal the luminous swell of her bosom. Taking up the hem of her skirts, she tucked the sides into the waist of her bodice, showing a shocking expanse of leg. Jimmie looked away, embarrassed, and Ariana's eyebrows shot to her hairline. After some thought, Rosemary also took off her dainty shoes to reveal 2 feminine, snow-white feet. Thrusting her shoes and Ariana's moon at a red-faced Jimmie, she whispered to him, "Jimmie, stay thou away from the door, and try not to attract the attention of any man who passes. If thou hearest a scream, run and find help, but else do nothing until we get back. Dost thou hear?"
"My lady, I'm nearly 13. I can fight if need be."
"I know thou canst, but force is not what's needed here. Stealth is. If I cannot find out by stealth what I need to know, there shall be plenty of opportunity for thee to prove thy mettle. Agreed?" Jimmie acquiesced and snuck around to the side of the alehouse, the better to remain out of sight. Rosemary moved to enter the tavern, but Ariana grabbed her arm, her eyes wide with the memory of that disastrous night at the Scots Arms Inn. And that time they had done nothing to tempt their attackers save breathe.
Hast thou any idea what thou art doing?
"None whatsoever. Except that I believe a sailor fresh from sea is made more vulnerable by a willing woman than by any sword. Let me take the lead. And keep thy dagger handy, we may need it." Tossing back her hair, Rosemary strode into the open door of the pub. Ariana, close on her heels, reeled as the stench of seldom-washed bodies, exotic pipe smoke, liquor, and bravado assailed her nostrils. Rosemary discreetly pointed to a sailor lounging at a table who wore a distinctive red bandana about his brow. "I saw that one disembark the Moira. Let us hope he can help us." Turning her back to the bar so that she might survey the room, Rosemary leaned on it in a pose that thrust her bosom forward and cocked one hip invitingly, then subtly gestured for Ariana to do the same. Shooting her a look that was part fear and part fury, Ariana did so, arranging her hair becomingly over one eye. Rosemary hid behind her own hair for a moment and instructed in an undertone, "Do not move until I say. Let us give him the notion that our encounter is his idea." Casting a steady eye on her mark, she placed a small, knowing smile upon her lips and silently willed the man to look up and notice her gaze. She wore such a look of admiration and invitation upon her face that any man who craved the attention of a woman, particularly after so long at sea, could not fail to respond. Or at least, so she hoped. "God, prithee let this work. For our sake and for Pete's." At last she caught his eye, and though he concealed it quickly, the look of interest on his face before he made himself look away told Rosemary that he was likely to respond. But the fact that he had looked away bespoke a man who either had no money and thought himself out of the game, or one who preferred a chase, a game of wits, to simply bargaining for a purchase. Inwardly, Rosemary groaned her impatience. As she was debating with herself over the best way to make contact, a grizzled seaman not from the Moira approached to admire the merchandise. Ariana shuddered as the man lifted a strand of her hair and rubbed it between his fingertips.
"I have a coin or two in me purse. So how much is it for a taste of those pretty lips?"
Rosemary raised an eyebrow at her friend, her unspoken message, "Play it gently, dissuade without causing a scene." Ariana looked the man in the eye and named a sum too astronomical to be acceptable.
4 shillings 6pence.
The sailor sputtered and dropped her hair.
4? Never heard of such a thing.
His eyes narrowed.
What are you playing at?
Ariana, despite her inner trembling, shrugged nonchalantly, indicating that the rough deck swab before her could take it or leave it. The sailor's eyes drifted to Rosemary, who quickly added, "Look not to me if the cost be too dear. We work for the same fee. Take thy pick." The man looked back to Ariana, who turned deliberately bored eyes on him, as though she offered herself for such a lofty sum every day. The sailor spat, eyeing them both mistrustfully. It was clear to him that something was amiss, but since he could not conceive of what, he chose not to press the issue. "Well done," Rosemary whispered to Ariana as the man grumbled his way over to the other side of the bar. Rosemary snuck a peek at the Moira's sailor, whom she now thought of as Red Bandana. She was certain he had taken note of the exchange. Once again she turned her unblinking gaze on him and coquettishly tucked a lock of ebony hair behind her ear. Red Bandana smiled to himself as he glanced at the woman with the almond-shaped eyes. She was too dark of eye and hair for most Englishmen's tastes, but he had traveled the world and had seen how a more exotic sensuality could arouse the appetite. For a minute he simply returned her gaze, playing out the silent game of cat and mouse, until she tipped her head to the side, revealing the long column of her white throat. It was an unmistakable invitation, and he bit. Raising his hand, he called loudly to the ostler,
"Two more ales here."
The ostler ambled over with 2 brimming tin mugs in his beefy hand. Momentarily hidden from the sailor's view by the ostler's large frame, Rosemary quickly motioned Ariana away from her. Ariana slipped quietly around to the other side of the room, ready to play her part when the time was right. The sailor received his 2 ales and, looking at Rosemary meaningfully, slid one of them toward the seat across from him. Languidly, Rosemary shifted away from the bar and moved toward him, making certain her hips undulated sensuously as she traversed the room. Gracefully swiveling into the seat, Rosemary nodded her thanks at the sailor and took a long pull of the ale. Of course, now that she was sitting down, she had no idea how to proceed. To buy herself time, she licked the foam from her top lip and set the mug back on the table, inviting him with a look to speak first. The sailor's accent was rough, but the eyes deeply set in his weathered face shone with experience-born intelligence, and he spoke as though every word was heavy with meaning.
"Be the ale to thy liking. There shall be more if you wish it. 'Tis odd. I come through here each time we dock, but I've not seen thee here before."
"Nay."
"Nay. I have a memory for a woman's face, and I know I've never seen you here. What brings thee here now?"
The sailor eyed Rosemary speculatively. "If I am not careful, he shall have the truth out of me ere I get one clue from him." Rosemary eyed him back thoughtfully, and let a small smile play about her lips whilst she stalled for time to think. She needed to tread carefully. "For a tale of mine, I shall have a tale of thine in return. From whence hast thou come?" The sailor grinned his approval at her boldness. To gain back the upper hand, he changed tack.
"You sent the other sailor away."
"Ah, you saw that?"
"Aye. Why?"
"Shall we say that I am, choosy? I liked not his looks, so I named him a price he could not pay. I needs must earn a coin or 2 this day, but I am not so desperate that I cannot afford to select more desirable companions."
"Be that so. Pray, what be thy name, choosy wench?"
Rosemary shrugged and half lowered her eyelids, looking at him from under her lashes. The sailor took a long pull on his ale, studying her in return as he waited for her reply. Suddenly he laughed and slammed the mug down upon the table with a hearty thump.
"Ha! All right. Since you wish it, I shall speak first. I just disembarked from my final voyage for at least a year or 2, and a good one it was. Sailing under the illustrious barbarian hath more benefits to a sailor than thou hast had hot dinners, thou knowest."
Not having gotten the response he had expected upon mentioning the barbarian's name, he tilted his head at her.
"Surely his name is not strange to thee?"
"Who knows not the dread barbarian?" Rosemary lied.
"Indeed. So thou canst imagine how good the trade hath been upon his ship, and to make it even better, we were attacked. After being foolish enough to challenge the barbarian, that bold Maltese trading ship sweetly gave up her bounty to us. To myself especially, as I'd amassed quite a bit more shares than the average able-bodied. But surely you must suspect that already, 'Tis why thou didst accept my company and not the other villains. Even if thou gavest me the same sum you named for the other fellow, I can afford it. Provided you're worth it, of course."
He took a long draught of his ale and wiped his mouth across his sleeve.
"Now, thou canst not argue that 'tis my turn to ask thee a question. Just how much didst thou ask of the other fellow to make him turn tail like that?"
4 and 6. The sailor pursed his lip and ran his finger thoughtfully along his chin.
I can understand his disappointment. How do you justify such a sum?"
Mayhap thou didst notice that I do not work alone? Rosemary nodded across the room to Ariana, who approached warily but placed one hand on the sailor's shoulder, the other on her outthrust hip. Rosemary was grateful to her friend for going along with the plan. This was not easy on either of them, especially after the Scots Arms Inn. But Red Bandana seemed to be buying the act. He looked up at the blonde and nodded that he had indeed seen her in his earlier perusals. He liked the contrast of the bolder one's dark hair and red lips with the fair beauty of her companion, and his eyes roved Ariana's curves without shame.
Unnoticed.
Rosemary quickly began to spin her tale, because at the sailor's blunt perusal, Ariana had begun to blanch. My friend here was returned to these shores just months ago. As a child, she was captured and sold by Moorish slave traders. She speaks only a few words of English, but that should not deter thee, for I can speak to her with my hands, and she understands me. Whilst still captive, it should interest thee to know that she was trained in a seraglio. What she learned there, the ways she knows to please a man.
Go on.
Alone she would be well worth the asking price. With mine own not unremarkable skills added to hers, well, shall it be understood that such a price is an unfathomable bargain?
Mayhap. Convince me, wench.
Ah, is this the price for using my gift in such a manner, God? I did truly think this would be easier, and we would not have to actually think. Well, I grant thou that one must not simply take a woman's word for it. Seeing as thou art a man of means,
Aye?
there is an arrangement we make for men who can afford such, luxuries. Naturally, no grain merchant worth doing business with would sell a bag of oats without first allowing the buyer to run those oats through his fingers, to determine if they are worth the price, of course. Ariana looked horrified. The sailor grinned.
Meaning?
Only that if you are truly of a mind to purchase, sir, we would be pleased to accompany thee outside. Just a small taste, you understand, to determine that thou wilt indeed get thy money's worth. Ariana's eyes widened even further, but Rosemary told her with a look that they would have the information they needed long before they were compromised.
By all means, then, let us go. I have no business here that cannot wait.
And pushing his mug aside, the sailor gestured for the two women to precede him. Mouthing the words silently as they walked before him, Rosemary cautioned Ariana, "Have thy dagger ready." Ariana gave an almost imperceptible nod and took a deep breath. Rosemary led the sailor around the side of the building. Seeing them approach, Jimmie began to rise from where he crouched on the ground, but a tiny shake of Rosemary's head stopped him. With her eyes, she asked him to keep alert, and then turned and took the sailor's hand, walking backwards enticingly as she directed him to a sparsely wooded area behind the tavern. "Sir, all I ask of thee is this. Permit us to do all the work. Thou shalt have no need to lift a finger. Agreed?" The sailor laughed his approval.
Done.
Rosemary took a deep breath to steady herself, smiled at the sailor, and reached for his waist. Slowly, she lifted the sides of his shirt free from his breeches and caressed his bare sides beneath the shirt, testing her nails against his skin the way some of the poems in her books described women touching men. She heard the sailor's intake of breath and knew that he had been long enough without companionship that, so long as she kept him distracted, he would pose no threat until it was too late. Indeed, she could already see his eyes fluttering closed. His defenses down, he suspected nothing. Lifting his shirt over his head, she caught Ariana's eye. Pointedly, she looked from the dagger at Ariana's hip to the man's breeches, then back again. Ariana shook her head at Rosemary. What? Then her eyes suddenly widened as she understood. Standing behind the sailor, Ariana reached around him and tried with shaking fingers to unbuckle his belt. Rosemary helped, and a thin sheen of sweat shone on the sailor's brow as he felt those 4 feminine hands undo the buckle and slide the belt from around his waist. Rosemary nodded at Ariana and, swallowing her fear, lifted the sailor's hands to her hair as she pulled his head down for a kiss. Ariana had wrapped one arm around the man's waist and slid the dagger from its sheath so silently that, lost in his ecstasy, the sailor was unaware. Rosemary felt the sailor's hands tighten in her hair, and she brought her lips close to his. "Before we go on, I have but one question for thee," she breathed against his mouth. "To where doth the Moira sail? Where will she dock next?"
What?
The sailor whispered huskily, his breath heaving in his chest and his eyes closed in anticipation of Rosemary's kiss. Then his eyes flew open as he felt the unmistakably sharp blade of a dagger pressing against the cloth between his legs. Where, Rosemary asked, this time in a normal voice, doth the Moira next sail, and for how long shall she dock? The sailor was by now fully aware of himself, and he angrily tightened his grip on Rosemary's hair. But behind him, Ariana pressed the blade a fraction deeper, and the sailor froze. Despite his superior size, the hold that Ariana had about his waist, and the skill with which she held the blade, told him that any move he made would not be fast enough to keep her from doing him damage in his most sensitive parts. Glaring at Rosemary, he growled,
What do you want? My gold?
I am sorry, sir. We do not wish to take thy money, but our friend aboard the Moira is in peril. In which direction doth she sail? The sailor loosened his grip on Rosemary's hair, but shot daggers at her with his eyes.
What makes you think I know, then?
Rosemary stepped a pace away and glanced quickly down at the man's private parts. For thine own sake, I hope thou dost.
Do you know what'll happen to me if I tell thee? 'Tis no light vessel, but the barbarian's own ship you're asking for, you know.
I know what will happen if you do not.
Ariana threatened from behind, and pressed the blade in even closer. The sailor's body tensed further, and Rosemary felt sorry for him. We truly wish thee no harm, but we are desperate, sir. The Moira? The sailor looked as though he might strangle Rosemary, but he spoke.
They are headed to La Rochelle by way of the English Channel. I know not where from there.
How long will she dock in La Rochelle? Once again the sailor balked, but Ariana tightened her arm about his waist, and in anticipation of the dagger coming closer, he winced.
Less than a week. Now I've told thee all, and may the knowledge of it damn thee both.
Taking his belt, Rosemary led him to a tree, with Ariana holding the dagger now to his bare side, and belted his arms in a wide circle about its trunk. Forgive us, sir, but we would not have thee following us.
If the barbarian ever finds out 'twas I would told thee.
Methinks he is more in fear of being discovered as a traitor to this barbarian than he is angry at the deception itself. I grant thou hast no reason to trust either of us, yet I swear I shall never tell from whence we received our information.
Nor I.
Ariana agreed, and resheathed the dagger at her waist as if to prove she meant the sailor no further harm. The sailor grunted by way of acknowledgment, then rested his forehead on his arms, stretched wide as they were around the tree. He looked so miserable that Rosemary felt a stab of pity. With some trepidation, she gently leaned in and touched the sailor's bare arm as he glared at her. Thinkest thou on this? She said, offering an apologetic smile. Thou mayest well have saved a man's life with this news. And good things, as we all do know, come in threes. With the treasure thou hadst of the Maltese ship, and now saving the life of a good man, surely thou art due some spectacular good turn to bring thee to three. The sailor looked up, and despite his grim mouth, his eyes no longer glittered with anger.
So long as it not be in the form of a woman.
Amen, laughed Rosemary shakily, and followed Ariana, who had already run around to the side of the alehouse and the safety of Jimmy's side. Angrily yanking her chemise back on her shoulders, Ariana was muttering dark oaths underneath her breath. Rosemary cleared the side of the building as Jimmy looked betwixt the two of them and sputtered,
My lady, miss! What?
Thank God! Thank God! Oh, thank thee, God! Rosemary intoned as she yanked her own chemise up to cover her bosom, then leaned her back against the wall and tipped her head up, the better to breathe as her fear caught up with her. Now that the danger was past, Ariana's blood was racing, and she punched Rosemary hard on the arm.
Never, never make me do that again!
Come, quickly, Rosemary replied, grabbing her shoes from Jimmy and thrusting them onto her feet. Recovering Ariana's moon from the speechless boy, Rosemary pressed the pendant into her friend's hands, quickly kissing them as she did so by way of apology. Running back toward their home, she shouted breathlessly over her shoulder at the others as they followed. At least we found out what we needed to know! Pete is headed for La Rochelle, and if God is still with us, even then he may not be beyond our reach!